So here's the thing. Spring break, you know, you may want to get started on the book review. Book review, you've heard about it. So, and you may have figured out at this point you don't really need the book review. You weren't trying to get an A anyway. You seem to have enough points. You may also be in the mood where it's like, it's looking a little too close to 70 for me, so I probably should do the book review. If you're thinking of doing the book review, but you don't know what book to read, I always suggest to the 1301 class Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, because it's really interesting and relatively short. And it's pretty straightforward. It's not a big mystery what it's about. Now, if you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, you should. That's why I think you should read the book. But he's African-American escaped slave who ends up being an advisor to Frederick Douglass, and no, he is Frederick Douglass, to Abraham Lincoln, and then eventually ambassador to Haiti later on. So he's also clearly an abolitionist, but also a women's rights activist. He's pretty brilliant as well, self-taught, self-educated, so you'll be impressed when you read his stuff. So. All right, I think I'm muting somebody just in case. Yeah, I had somebody earlier not mute themselves, and then they said something that probably wasn't good, and it was actually about me. So it's like, that's not cool, is it? So not that I thought somebody was going to say something about me, but yeah, it was unpleasant for them, I think. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sure it must have been.
Well, it was probably more unpleasant for me, but because they were not complimentary. I thought I was a fine teacher. I know.
I think you are.
Well, thanks. That's extra points for you. So
yes. That's why I got to compliment the teacher.
I know you got to do what you can, because what if the grades are low? But the Frederick Douglass fellow, he would not have been that way. He just kind of like said what he thought, and he would have been a little more like the student that said that I wasn't a superb professor. But Frederick Douglass also would have accepted the consequences. So, but if you haven't read about him, the reason I would recommend the book is it's relatively short. It's really easily available. It should be interesting. It's very straightforward, and he's important. And I'm pretty sure we don't know enough about him collectively as the American public. So think about reading the book, and I will think about teaching the class now. Yeah. If you have a question about the book review, you want a book approved, something like that, that's not on the giant book list, let me know. Yeah, and you guys don't worry. I know you get in when you can, and sometimes you don't have control over internet, and sometimes you're just late. Cool, I get it. I'm gonna remind you of a couple things. Let's see if I open the right things. Goodness, I hope so. Do you see this? The list of stuff to study. Okay, all right. So this is the quiz review. So it's just got a list of things that you might study to prepare for the quiz. The quiz hopefully is open. I noticed somebody took it, so I guess it worked for at least one person. So that's good. And they seem to do well, so that's also good. So maybe the notes were helpful, hopefully. So we'll look over the stuff. And today's chapter is really full. I forgot about that, but that's good, right? Sure. All right, so we have the list of stuff, and then we have the weekly question. Hopefully this is the weekly question, not my comments about the weekly question. Okay. Today's weekly question, which you can turn this in by Friday, but you can also turn it in by after spring break, by the next, like a Monday after spring break. So it's not urgent. If you don't get it done, you can finish it up during spring break. You may, after class today, go like, no, I'm just going to knock that out. That's cool, whatever you decide. I would prefer you did the quiz before spring break if you have to choose between the two. I think for you, it's better if you get them both done, but I also know you may have 8 million other things to do. So John Marshall, who was he? What makes him significant in U.S. history? Be sure to discuss writings, events, or court cases in your discussion. I had a few people turn this one in early and hear my thoughts about this. And I mentioned that these thoughts to these folks. And if you were one of these people and you turned it in early, make sure that if you want, you correct it and turn it back in. Okay. John Marshall is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for about 30 years, starting around 1802, 03, somewhere in there, 01. Yeah, 01, that's when it starts, 1801. And he's on the Supreme Court for about 30 years. He's the first Chief Justice, I'm struggling there, to stay more than a couple of years. And he helps elevate the office of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to an important office that becomes a coveted office. So that's kind of important. He's also a Federalist, and he remains a voice for the Federalist Party. I don't know that we want to call him the party, because he's a Federalist after the Federalist Party goes away. So he's going to be a continuing voice for a strong national government, even in an era where most politicians didn't want a strong national government. So that makes him kind of as well. And he is going to write the ruling for Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison, which is the first Supreme Court case where the court declares part of a federal law, congressional act, be unconstitutional. And it establishes the precedent of judicial review. And I really think you should talk more about that, especially if you're one of the folks who turned it in early and I said, hey, I don't like this. It's not exactly how I said it. It was probably more polite. But you should talk more about that case. And we will before class is over. Okay, I just don't want to do it right now because I want to put it in a little more context. You know how history teachers are. We love context. Okay. Somebody's texting me. Is it one of you? Stop texting me. It's not you. Let me find the notes. All right, here we go. I'm going to check just to make sure. My dad has texted me like 3 times today. There's an anonymous text that says, can we play a game on Saturday? I should just text back and say, sure. I have no idea who they are, but it's like, sure, play on Saturday. I don't care. Instead, we'll talk about chapter 8. It'll be much better. And I've put my phone away. So it's much better plan, isn't it? So, Bill of Rights, we talked about all that stuff last time. We're good, aren't we? We're ready to go. I've just got to check off whoever's just sliding into class there. Here we go. George Washington's presidency. Everything George Washington does is important because he's the first president, so he's setting a precedent for being president. It's very exciting. It's like the first time your girls' basketball team wins the state championship. It sets the precedent. I know. Go Cedar Park. Cedar Park. I know, T-Wolves, what is it? What are we supposed to say? Forever Cedar Park High. There you go. All right, I remember. Okay, even though it's been forever since I taught there, or a couple of years. All right, so George Washington, when they wrote the office of the presidency, they knew he would be the fellow who assumed it or took it over because he was just a presidential kind of guy. He was that guy who made decisions that tended to be in the best interest of everyone, not just himself. He really did a good job of avoiding self-interest. One of the things I like about him, we hung out, is because he picked people, cabinet officials, that he thought were best suited to give advice rather than people who would just tell him what he wanted to hear. I think it's pretty common in the modern era for presidents to pick people who tell them what they want to hear, or to maybe reward certain groups of supporters by appointing a certain person to be in an office. I think that's typically what we see. That could just be my jaded view of modern politics. But Washington picked a whole bunch of folks that he thought were really good at what they did, and they also argued with each other, which may have been good, may have been bad. You can decide. Washington's vice president, he's the runner-up kind of guy. He's John Adams. He was considered a really capable lawyer. If you remember back to, what was it that he got those soldiers off for? The Boston Massacre. Yeah, that's what it was. He's a really good lawyer. So Good, an important legal mind, a good advocate for the United States, certainly good at negotiating with England. Um, he also picked Alexander Hamilton, who will later get a musical, as you know, as the Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, Henry Knox, as Secretary of War, I'm having trouble speaking today, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. Okay. There is a question on the quiz, I'm pretty sure, I know there is, about Alexander Hamilton's 5-part Treasury program. So you may want to take a peek at this. Alexander Hamilton is one of the few founding fathers that can sing and dance at the same time. And also, no, maybe he could, I don't know, but also thought that the future of the United States was in business. It was not in agriculture. So he thought that it would be important to promote a manufacturing base, hence the report on manufacturers, which is not how we would say it in the modern era, but there you go. And he also wanted to establish a national bank. Many of the more we've got to be a republic of small farmers guys did not want a national bank, and they surely did not want to support manufacturing essentially, because they thought business was corrupt and they thought banks were corrupt, but owning land was wholesome and pure and a good way to wealth. I think that Hamilton more correctly saw that both of these would be important to establishing a broad economy that would lead to, future growth and future strength, that sort of thing. So Washington really picks the right guy to be Treasury Secretary, I'm sure of that. Probably the most important success of the Hamilton plan is the creation of the national bank. He's really pretty skilled at negotiating to get the states to agree to consolidate their debt, especially since a couple of states had a whole lot of debt and the rest of the states weren't that keen about paying it off. I think you'll hear similar discussions in the modern era after this COVID bill is signed, because there are a couple of states that are getting their debt paid off and a couple of other states that aren't happy about it. So it's a similar sort of issue. The emphasis that Hamilton had was he wanted to create national unity, and he thought that if every state got their debt paid off, because a lot of the debt was achieved by let me try again, really am struggling. A lot of the debt was created, it's probably a better word, in fighting the revolution. So they want every state to have a fresh start, and then what they do after that is kind of, on the and to raise national funds, there are going to be certain taxes, import tax and excise tax on producing whiskey, that sort of thing. And some of these things are more popular than other things, but make sure that you're aware that the Bank of the United States, which is sometimes abbreviated BUS, is created, and that national debt is consolidated. Yeah, bank, national debt, all right. Hamilton's ideas are definitely opposed by Madison and Jefferson and the folks that we talked about. And it immediately leads to a discussion of what does the Constitution allow. So Washington is convinced that the national bank could be useful. He's just not sure it's constitutional. So he entertains an argument from these folks about whether the bank is constitutional or not. So Madison and Jefferson are going to argue that creation of a national bank is not constitutional because they are going to use the strict interpretation of the Constitution. If the Constitution does not say yes, then the answer is no. There you go. So you have to have implicit or explicit permissions. Like, which of those words am I trying to use? It has to say, the document has to say it's okay to do this before you can do it. And Hamilton is going to argue kind of the teenager version of the Constitution, the broad interpretation, where if it doesn't specifically say no, then the answer is yes. So I would always tell when I just taught the high school kids, it would be like if your parents gave you a car to use, and your interpretation of the rules regarding the car was would be, I can just use this car whenever I need it. As long as you give me the car, I can use it. I don't have to ask for specific permission to go certain places. Broad interpretation of car use. Strict interpretation of car use is your parents' interpretation. It's like you'll use the car for good and not for evil. Like you'll go over to your friend's house to study for history, but you won't go down to 6th Street with the car. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So going to 6th Street, broad interpretation. Parents never said you couldn't go, so therefore you did. In strict interpretation is only use the car for good, only for what you have specific permission to use it for. And you have to ask permission for things beyond that. All right. Well, what is interesting about this, I think, is that Hamilton wins the argument. And the reason I think that's interesting, that broad construction and, we get to make the bank wins, is because Hamilton is arguing the meaning of the Constitution against the guy who wrote the Constitution, and Hamilton wins the argument. How annoying would that be? How annoying would that be? It would be like if you wrote a paper and your English teacher told you what it meant, but you're the one who wrote it. It's like, no, I know you wrote this, but it really means this. Wouldn't that be annoying? Yeah. Okay. So you can see why Madison and Jefferson were annoyed with Hamilton, because he out-argued the guy who wrote the Constitution about the meaning of the Constitution. It's really annoying. All right. So in some instances, Washington listens to Hamilton. In some instances, he listens to Jefferson and Madison. Sorry for the yawn. And it will lead to Jefferson eventually resigning because it just annoys him. So, I don't know. Jefferson and Hamilton were not buddies. Now, Jefferson's not going to shoot him or anything like that. Someone else will do that. Sorry, way too much talking today. Or every Tuesday and Thursday. All right, so there's a whole lot of discussion in here, strict versus broad construction. Also, one of the little tricky things that Hamilton does to make sure that he gets a national bank. Madison had gone to each state delegation and explained why that interpretation of the Constitution was wrong and why the bank was unnecessary. And he took like graphs and charts and did all the nerdy kind of things. And then Hamilton did the I'll sell you something kind of thing. He said, you know what? We've been moving the capital around. I know we're going to try to find a permanent place for it. How about you vote for the national bank and I'll make sure the capital stays in the South? And the Southern states went, cool, sounds like a deal. So at first they voted against creating the national bank, but then when they got the deal to have the capital in the South, they voted for it. And then Madison's like, that's not how this is supposed to work. You're supposed to be able to use graphs and charts and convince people. You shouldn't do a bribe. And Hamilton goes, no, bribe, pretty cool. All right, broad construction works for Hamilton. There we go. French Revolution occurs also during this time period, and that's problematic for people in the United States because, I don't know, because we had sworn allegiance to France, and we said whenever they have a dispute with England, that we would back them up. Well, they're about to have a dispute with everyone because it's the French Revolution. They're also going to say that the French Revolution is based on American principles found in the Declaration of Independence. So at first, especially guys like Jefferson are going, that is cool, because he wrote the Declaration, plus he loves France. And then when the French revolutionaries break out the guillotine and start chopping off heads, people go like, that doesn't seem like a revolution based on freedom. That just seems like a bunch of crazy dudes chopping off people's heads with a guillotine. So we're trying to back away from the French Revolution, the people who liked France, and then Washington doesn't want to have anything to do with this at all. Because Washington has two goals. It's two. I didn't want you to think I was like showing you the finger or anything. Washington has two goals. These two goals would include one, staying out of war. The reason he wants to stay out of war is we're a brand new country. War is expensive and we don't have much of a military. It's probably a good plan. 2, no political parties, because if the political parties fight with each other, it divides the country. We're a new country. We just got together. If we get divided now, it's going to be a problem. So he wants national unity and no international conflict. Those are his two goals. And he's going to warn people in his farewell address that they should follow those goals as well. And they don't, of course. So French Revolution starts. The Federalist kind of guys, even though we don't have political parties, the ones who are kind of the Hamilton, Washington, Adams wing of folks, they like England and oppose recognition of the French revolutionary government. Madison and Jefferson favor the French Revolution initially, and then, you know, when the head chopping stuff starts, they go like, no, we're out. France also sends an envoy to the United States, as Edmund Genet. And Genet says, you know what? If you guys want to arm your merchant ships and shoot at English ships, we're cool with that. We'll deputize you as part of the French Navy, and you guys just go for it. And Washington says, let's not do anything crazy, and won't even meet with him. And then eventually, the French revolutionary government wants to chop Genet's head off, so then he stops speaking for them and goes to New York and marries a rich woman. Sometimes you have to go to New York and marry a rich woman or a rich guy, whichever you would prefer. But we don't form an alliance with France. France eventually allows us to get out of the Treaty of Amity and Friendship that we had signed during the American Revolution, and we'll buy Louisiana later on. We'll have a continued relationship with France that's going to be a little tricky, and is also going to double the size of the United States. So it's fairly important. We were upset with Great Britain during this time period. We're also upset with France a little bit. France is trying to draw us into the war. Great Britain believes we're still part of Great Britain. So they occasionally will take over our ships and steal our stuff and say, you know what, we're going to use this for the war effort. And we're also going to draft the dudes on the ship and put them in the British Navy. It's called impressment. We are not impressed by that. We're very upset about it. So there are people within the United States who want to declare war on England because of that. There are other people that want to declare war on France because they're acting a little crazy. And then Washington is like, nope, we don't want to declare war on anybody. We want to stay out. So Washington's trying to steer a path of neutrality. Pretty sure that phrase shows up from time to time in people's answers and textbooks. So let's see if we want to say anything else. Oh yeah, Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion is pretty weird. It's not like a whole bunch of drunk guys, but there's a bunch of Pennsylvania farmers who produce whatever grain that you use to make whiskey. I don't know if it's corn, or I suppose it's more than one grain. I don't know. What do I know about whiskey? But they do not want to pay the tax they have to pay to turn whatever grain that they've produced into whiskey. They don't want to pay the excise tax. So they decide they're going to go all shays on the new government, and they're just going to bring up an army, and they're going to rebel, and they're going to refuse to pay the tax. And George Washington is having none of it. I'm saying none of it. So he gets on his old uniform from his army days, grabs the horse, leads the troops, and heads on out to Pennsylvania. He leads about 13,000, a little bit more troops to put down the rebellion, which is really small, and they arrest two guys, and those guys get charged with treason, and they sentence them to death because Washington is not playing around with this rebellion stuff. So he wants to make sure that people understand you do not rebel against your own government. And why? Is it because Washington is tough and will come and kick your butt? Potentially. Or is it because we have built in a system of elections that allows you to remove people from office that pass laws you don't like? I'm going to go with that. So rather than having constant rebellion in the United States, we instead want to have constant elections, which we do. And I have soccer friends, of course, from Brazil, because if you're going to have soccer friends, they might as well be from Brazil, right? And they are amazed at how we vote for everything here. It's like, yeah, we vote for all kinds of stuff. We love to vote. Like we're going to have city elections in May. It's like, why didn't you have them in December? It's like, because we don't want to. You'll have a school board election. Sometimes we elect like the dog catcher. We elect a lot of stuff. We like elections. So we elect judges in Texas. So yeah, okay. All right, so no rebellion, just elections. There you go. All Oh, they do pardon the two guys, by the way. They don't execute them. And one of them is probably a little delusional, apparently. He's not quite right. So, and not that we were upset about arresting and executing people who were not mentally healthy during that time period, because we just didn't care about stuff like that yet. We will later. Yeah. Okay. Washington definitely trying to make a point for sure. Washington finishes his presidency, he gives the farewell address where he gives the wave, and he says in a speech written by Alexander Hamilton, he says that you should avoid entangling foreign alliances, stay out of foreign countries' international affairs, and avoid faction political parties because it will disrupt the unity of the United States government. So we end up being 0 for 2, excuse me, on Washington's advice. And every once in a while, I would have a high school student or even a college student who would say, in the 1302 class, you know, when we do the World War I, World War II thing, they would say, if we just followed Washington's advice, I'm not even sure Washington would have followed Washington's advice in the 20th century, because things changed quite a bit between 1776 and say 1917 when we entered World War I. All right, stuff that's going on. Second president, John Adams. Now this is one of the elections where we have 2 or 3 of these elections where the guy who comes in first gets to be president, the guy who comes in second gets to be vice president. This works when the guy who comes in first is George Washington, because who in their right mind is going to mess with George Washington? But when the guy who wins is John Adams, who's kind of annoying, and the guy who gets second place is Thomas Jefferson, who's a sneaky little dude. He's not sneaky. He's just a really clever fellow that likes to, you know, argue. This is going to be problematic. John Adams was always right, and Thomas Jefferson always liked to argue. So this pairing is going to be a little rough. Plus, they are going to represent the 2 factions or political parties that develop, and it's a mess. It would be like if, oh gosh, I can't even imagine this, but if our president were Joe Biden, I can imagine that. I'm not saying that. And our vice president were Donald Trump. Can you imagine? That would not be pretty. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that this is quite that bad, but these guys definitely fought each other's programs. So Adams gets elected. Jefferson is vice president. The British and the French are fighting. Adams favors the British. Jefferson favors the French. Oh gosh, we send some negotiators over. We send our Chief Justice and some other folks over. Who do we send over? John Marshall, John Jay, and maybe Henry Clinton. I can't remember. Crud, it doesn't matter. It does matter to them. It doesn't matter to you for your quiz. So we send these guys over to negotiate with the French government so that, you know, maybe we can get out of the Treaty of Amity and Friendship so that, you know, we can solve some issues. And they go, you want to talk to us? You got to pay us a bribe first. And we're not paying bribes. We don't do that. So our emissaries came back and reported to Congress, and they said, hey, they said we had to pay them a bribe first. And we said no. And they said, we talked to these 3 guys, and they called them Messrs. X, Y, and Z, hence the XYZ affair. And the phrase that comes out of that is millions for defense, but not 1 penny for tribute. So the people who favored England use this as a rallying cry, an anti-French rallying cry, and a way to build up the military, which also leads to a weird dispute between John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, who have really similar political philosophies, but John Adams' son is in the Navy, and Hamilton's, I think it's his son-in-law, is in the Army. And Hamilton wants his son-in-law promoted, and Adams doesn't like his son-in-law for some reason. So it leads to Adams building up the Navy and decreasing the size of the Army or something. It's weird stuff. But anyway, Adams doesn't have as much patience with people who disagree with him, and neither apparently does the Federalist Party. So when the faction that turns into the Republicans start complaining about the Federalists passed some laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they make it illegal for you to talk bad about the government. And they also deport people if they talk bad about the government. And they double the amount of time you have to live in the United States before you can become a citizen, because what they figured out is that the newest immigrants are more likely to be Republicans than Democrats. Can you imagine people using immigration policy to beef up their political aspirations? I can't imagine anyone would ever do that. Or people have been doing that almost since the beginning of the country. So we're going to repress immigrants during this time period because they tend to favor the party not in power. And I don't know, repress, that's fair, because we're deporting them and doubling the amount of time they need to become a citizen. So the party in power, the Federalist Party, passes this bill, Adams signs it, and then the Republicans say, like, hey, First Amendment, wasn't the whole purpose of the First Amendment political speech? And then you've just limited political speech, and you can deport people because of it and throw them in jail. This is wrong. There should be a resolution. So they passed the Kentucky and Virginia resolution. Madison writes the Virginia resolutions. Jefferson writes the Kentucky resolution. And they both assert that you don't have to enforce laws that you believe to be unconstitutional. And the Kentucky resolution actually says that you can declare it to be unconstitutional. You can nullify it within your own state. That's going to be fairly controversial, and that will come back up later. That's one of those back in my mind, I'll save that for later kind of ideas. You're wondering, are they still talking about slavery? Yeah, a little, except we got a problem here. At first, we are backing the Haitian Revolution because they're using the principles of the American Revolution. This is led by a runaway slave, a former slave, Toussaint Louverture. And then France goes from revolution to dictatorship under Napoleon Bonaparte. They're kind of broke. They want to fight more with England. They really don't want their land in the United States anymore, or near the United States anymore. So they say, hey, United States, we know you want to buy Louisiana. You offered us, or not Louisiana, New Orleans. I'm sorry. You offered us 10 million bucks for New Orleans. And Jefferson had pushed that bill and gotten it. Did I mention that we're in Jefferson's presidency? I did not, did we? Did I? I am sorry. So Adams serves a term. He's definitely not a two-term guy. He also had the opportunity to declare war on France and decided not to take it, which probably was, it's people who study Adams, and I'm not disagreeing with them, would say it's probably the most noble thing that he does in his presidency, because his party really wants to declare war on France, and it's the reason he's only a one-term president. He understands that if he doesn't declare war on France, he's not going to get a second term, but he also knows it's not good for the United States, the same way that Washington said, we can't afford to declare war literally, and we might lose. So Adams finishes his term. Jefferson and his vice president, Aaron Burr, it's the last time we do the winner and runner-up thing, because that's going to lead to a dispute that leads to Alexander Hamilton getting shot. While Burr will shoot him, while Burr's the vice president. That's bad for you, vice president shooting people, isn't it? But also the French Revolution's wrapping up. It turns into a dictatorship, or I don't know what Napoleon, emperor, yeah, it's a dictatorship. So Napoleon Bonaparte makes it clear that he's willing to sell New Orleans. We offer $10 million. Jefferson signs a bill that allows us, or signs an agreement that allows us to offer $10 million for New Orleans. And then the French negotiators say, like, hey, for 5 million more, we'll throw in the rest of Louisiana. It's not like anybody lives there anyway. And that would double the size of the United States. So Jefferson thinks, wow, that's a really cool idea. And then he also says, wow, I think that the government should not have very much power, but if I don't go back to Congress to get this bill, then, I make this decision without them. Is that okay? So he asked Napoleon Bonaparte, do you mind if I take a little bit of time, I go back to Congress, maybe ask for a constitutional amendment that gives me the power to purchase land, or a new bill that allows me to add Louisiana to the Purchase. And he says, nope, you got to decide now. So Jefferson decides to make the Louisiana Purchase, and his own party thinks that he's overstepped his authority. And it's a really close vote. I think it passes by a vote or two, because that's a treaty. It's got to be passed by 2/3, so pretty close. And his own party is also going to object to his power grab, I suppose it is, under the Embargo Act. Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act, England and France still at war, because that's just what they do until the 20th century. So they're always fighting with each other, and our ships are in the way. I mean, we're selling stuff to both sides. We're selling stuff to other people, but we've got to cross the Atlantic. So they're grabbing our ships, they're sinking them, they're grabbing our dudes, and we're just not okay with it. So we're trying to stay out of stuff with them. We're trying to not have our people grabbed and our stuff grabbed. And what Jefferson decides would be the best idea is the Embargo Act, which just says we're not selling stuff anymore unless you come over and buy it. So no more shipping. So the way to make sure your ships don't get grabbed on a transatlantic journey is to make sure there are no transatlantic journeys. This works. I mean, we don't lose any more sailors. We don't lose any more ships. Also, many, many, many businesses go bankrupt. So people see people in Jefferson's own party, other Republicans, see Jefferson as extending the power of the federal government through Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act in a way that contradicts the political philosophy of the Republicans, who believe in stronger state governments and weaker national governments. Does that make sense? A little? Okay. Hopefully you guys are still with me. I know it's been a long day. It's almost spring break. All right. We'll stop for just a second because I'll get some water. Do you guys have any questions that you would like to ask about any of that stuff? Okay, Davey?
Miss Serna.
Yes.
So with the whole moving the capital to the south thing that went down, would that have actually done anything?
Is it? I'm sorry. Hang on one second. I'm looking for my little volume thing because you're not loud, which I'm sure has nothing.
He's not loud for me either.
Okay. All right. So here's what I heard. That move the national capital to the south thing, and then I didn't hear the second part of the question. Sorry.
Would it actually have done anything?
Could it actually have done anything? Well, it got the South to agree to create the national bank, because they had been opposed to that before. So that was the sweeten the deal sort of thing. That was Hamilton's quid pro quo, essentially. If you agree to sign on to the national bank, because they had tried to pass the bill at first and it failed because Madison had gone from delegation to delegation and convinced him it was a bad idea. And then Hamilton went back and said, we're going to vote on this again. And if we give you the capital city, will you vote yes for the bank? And they went, sure. So they thought having the capital in the South would give them more influence over federal government. They may or may not be right. And you do see all of the first presidents, I think pretty much except Adams, being Virginians, which is, Southern. So I think they thought it was a good enough deal. I know that Madison was irritated by it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for asking. Sorry I couldn't get it the first time.
Yeah, actually, I remember in Hamilton they talk about it, and have you? Well, they sing about it.
Of course they do. Yeah.
That's what they do.
Yeah, the founding fathers went around dancing and singing, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, Jefferson might have, because he was pretty musical. He played guitar. That's not true. He played violin. That's the same thing, guitar, violin. And he played piano, I think. He met his wife at a music lesson, I think. She played piano.
How did you know this?
I know all kinds of useless things about history. You have no idea. No idea. Yeah, I could.
Extremely specific.
I know, it's weird. I have a degree or two that are related to history, And occasionally you have to read really weird stuff. So I read some really weird stuff about the founding generation and the Constitution. So I do know a lot of weird things there. And I know a lot of weird civil rights things too in the second half of the class.
That's funny.
It is kind of weird. Yeah. 'Cause
Yeah.
for certain types of degrees, you write a really long paper about something no one cares about. And my really long paper, yeah, no, it's true. The really long paper I wrote that no one cared about was about the influence of the civil rights movement on women's magazines in the 1950s and 60s. It's typically,
Yeah.
it's typically something your professor's writing a book about and they need research for. Not lying. It's free labor for them. So.
Yeah.
All right.
But I guess it works for your grade.
It does.
And your degree.
I did get a degree, so.
Hmm.
And my professor wrote a book, so it all worked out. All right.
That's pretty cool.
I suppose so. Yep. All right, here we are talking about stuff that's going to help you with the weekly question. Are you ready? Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison. Okay. So Jefferson takes office 1801, and I know I've already talked about Jefferson. And he says, this is the first time that we have traded presidencies from one party to another. So we've gone from officially no party during the Washington administration, but it was clearly Federalist. We've gone from the Federalist Party to the Republican Party. And people were concerned because Adams and Jefferson really didn't like each other at this point. Jefferson had tried to counteract a lot of things Adams did. Remember, Jefferson was his vice president. And there was some suspicion that there might be some conflict, that Adams wouldn't relinquish power, that you might have to bring in the military, although neither of these guys were really military guys. But Adams and Jefferson stay there together. They don't speak to each other for about 20 years. And Jefferson gives a nice speech where he says, we are all Republicans, we're all Federalists, we all want the same thing. We just may have different methods or ways to go about what we want. And we go on with life and everything's pretty good. We have a nice peaceful transition of power. But there are some little irritating things that happened. Adams, of course, knew after the election he wasn't going to be president again. So it's like, what can I do? Get ready for the next guy. I'm going to appoint 8 million people before he gets here so he doesn't get to appoint anybody. So any open office he's going to appoint. He wants to appoint people who agree with him, especially to offices like judicial offices where, you know, they might get to decide stuff. Maybe court cases, things like that. Or, you know, he just wants to make sure that his stronger central government opinion is represented even after he's gone. So he appoints John Marshall, who had been Secretary of State, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then he appoints a whole bunch of other people to a whole bunch of stuff. They refer to those as midnight appointments. So it's just last minute stuff. It's like, you know, how I do my grades and you do your work at the last minute. It's like, I gotta get it done. I gotta get it in, midnight appointment. So John Adams writes a bunch of these. The Secretary of State, John Marshall, is supposed to deliver these. He doesn't get them all delivered, so not everybody gets their job. And then when Madison, the new Secretary of State, comes in, he says, you know what, Thomas Jefferson, there's all these appointments on my desk. Should I deliver them or should we appoint our own people? And then Jefferson says, appoint our own people. And one of the guys who didn't get his appointment was this guy, William Marbury. You knew there was a reason for the story, right? William Marbury was supposed to become Justice of the Peace for Washington, D.C. I'm sure it's a great job. I have no idea what they did. My father-in-law was Justice of the Peace in San Angelo. I know what he did. He got to adjudicate very low-level criminal cases and declared people dead, which sounds like a terrible job. But anyway, Marbury wants this job. He feels like he's entitled to it, but he's not going to get it. So he sues the incoming Secretary of State, and the outgoing Secretary of State, John Marshall, is now Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He sues directly to the Supreme Court, not just because John Marshall's there and he figures he'll be favorable to his cause, but also because the Judiciary Act of 1789 said that it was okay for him, for a person who had a dispute with the federal government to sue directly to the Supreme Court, and that the Supreme Court could issue something called a writ of mandamus. And this would be like an executive order, but from the Supreme Court. So whatever they said would become law, and they would have to follow that decree. So what he's asking for is an executive order, a writ of mandamus from the court that says, I, William Marbury, can be Justice of the Peace for Washington, D.C. And he figures Marbury will be sympathetic because Marbury's the reason he's not Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C., because he didn't deliver his appointment. Does that all make sense so far? A little bit? It's a little complicated, but all right. So then the case goes to court and they look at the law, and Marbury says, according to the law, he's correct. That makes sense. I should be able to do this, except if I issue a writ of mandamus that has the effect of law, then I've either become a legislator or I've become a chief executive. And I'm not either, I'm a justice. So this is beyond the scope of our office. So it's not that it's illegal, it's just the law doesn't fit with the Constitution. So he and the court declare that part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 to be unconstitutional. So this is the first time that the Supreme Court declares part of a congressional act to be unconstitutional. And it establishes the power of judicial review, where the court looks at federal laws and says, yes, they're constitutional, or no, they're not. Okay? So when you are writing about John Marshall, which you inevitably will do at some point, either today and tomorrow or next week, make sure that you mention a couple of things: that he's a Federalist, and he's going to carry that Federalist legacy for the next 2 or 3 decades, even after the Federalist Party disappears. Mention that he's the first Chief Justice to stay more than 4 or 5 years. So it also elevates the office of Chief Justice to becoming something more important, rather than just that guy we send to go negotiate treaties or talk to 3 French guys who want bribes, because that did happen. And you also want to mention Marbury versus Madison specifically, and the ruling that establishes judicial review. And if you want, you can mention, how he was more personally involved in Marbury versus Madison. But at the very least, you've got to mention that he writes the opinion that declares the part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 to be unconstitutional, and this establishes the tradition of judicial review for the Supreme Court, where they declare laws to be constitutional or not. And it's the main thing that the Supreme Court does. And because they do this, it adds a check and balance, I suppose is fair, to the the legislative branch and to the executive branch, because the executive branch signs the laws, legislative branch makes the laws, and occasionally they may overrule an executive order as well, but it's not exactly judicial. Well, it is judicial. It is. Okay. So this happens early, 1803, in Jefferson's, right in the middle. Jefferson gets elected in 1800, takes office 1801. So it's kind of the middle of his first term. Louisiana Purchase, also middle of the first term. Embargo Act, end of the second term, I believe. Yeah, okay. So Louisiana Purchase, you want to be vaguely familiar with that. I think that's on your list of stuff to study. I assume you already know, your 8th grade teacher probably drilled that one into you, as they should. Doubles the size of the United States for $15 million. It probably exceeds the power that Jefferson thought that he had. It's a little controversial during the time period. It's going to lead to some Republicans being frustrated with Jefferson and saying he's not a real Republican. And that was a weird noise. It's going to lead to some issues within the United States in a Supreme Court case between the Republicans and the federal government, but it's sort of weird. All right. I don't think I know that I don't have a question about that on the quiz. I should, but I only have 10 questions, so I don't want to, I didn't want to save one for that. All right, so doubles the size of the United States. Treaty for the Purchase passes the Senate, but it's very close. Some Republicans think he exceeded his authority. And then, of course, Lewis and Clark expedition, and they explore and meet Sacagawea and do all kinds of cool stuff and put an arch in St. Louis. And arch, yeah, okay. All right, we're also fighting pirates during this time period, which is cool. I think the Obama administration got to fight pirates as well. So thankfully that happens from time to time. These pirates are in Northern Africa. They're grabbing our ships and stealing our stuff. And they took a frigate, which sounds like they're swearing, but it's a type of ship. And we didn't want to declare war because who really wants to have a war with Libya, Tripoli, with anybody, really? So we end up signing the Treaty of Tripoli. Now, I remember, because I'm old and think about history a lot, when in the Obama administration, people heralded the treaty, not the Obama administration itself, but, Facebook troll kind of people. It's like, yeah, we've always had a great relationship with Northern Africa, which is where not the terrorists were, but the pirates were that the Obama administration had to deal with. And we've frequently signed treaties with them, and they cited the Treaty of Tripoli and talked about how respectful we were. No, we are lying in the Treaty of Tripoli, where it says we respect the culture and the religious heritage of Tripoli. We didn't. I mean, you're signing a treaty, so you don't want to say, like, we think that you guys are crazy and that your religion is wrong. That we don't put that in treaties. Yeah. I mean, you have to formal diplomatic language, but anyway. So we end up signing a treaty to avoid a war with the folks in Northern Africa, which is good. And we also send the Navy there as well to threaten them a little bit. And so you've got Jefferson a little bit out of character, sending the Navy to threaten people, Louisiana Purchase, and you've got the Embargo Act. Okay. All right. And right at the end of the book, not the book, the chapter, they talk a little bit about the War of 1812. So you get like the 1-minute version. It's mostly between England and France. We're going to pick the French side. We're going to fight with England. And then things don't go very well. And the Federalist Party says, you know what, it's not going well. We should get out of this war and we should surrender. And then right after they say that, the tide sort of turns. England says, you know what, this isn't worth it anymore. At some point in there, too, the Canadians come and burn the White House. But the Federalist Party has a convention, the Hartford Convention, where they say, we should just get out of this war and cut our losses and surrender. Right after that is when the English decide to withdraw from the war. And then right after there's a treaty, that's when Andrew Jackson wins the Battle of New Orleans, which is weird that happens after the treaty. But because the Hartford Convention and the Federalists said we should get out of this, makes them look weak and like they've misjudged international events, and then people go, those guys are losers. And then the Federalist Party essentially disappears because they look, I'll quote myself here, at best, out of touch and unpatriotic at worst, perhaps treasonous. I know, it is bad. Okay. Some people do consider the War of 1812 to be the Second War of Independence because we won. We probably didn't win. We just didn't lose. So I would go with we tied, which is okay at a war when you're really the underdog. We were really the underdog, and England's the biggest world power. So to tie the biggest world power is really a win. It would be like if, I know Cedar Park High School basketball team won the state championship, but it would also be like if the next game they played the University of Texas and they beat them as well, or they tied them. If the Cedar Park High School team ties the University of Texas, that's a win. You know what I'm saying? So us tying in the War of 1812, we thought it was a win, except, the White House got burned. All right, but Dolly Madison saved the most important paintings, so it was good. Wow, I took up the whole time. Are you happy about that? Was it good? Was it worth your time? You got your money's worth today? I'm going to stop recording before I hear your answer.